The Russian war machine is starting to crack, and what happens next could shake the entire world. At first glance, the idea of Ukraine defeating Russia might seem impossible, but the truth may just shock you. From a rapidly vanishing war chest to Ukrainian tactics that have disrupted Russia's core ability to wage war, this is the truth about just how close Russia is to losing, and why that outcome might be even more dangerous than if it had won. Currently, Russia continues to slow crawl across eastern Ukraine, so slow, in fact, that it would take over a century to reach Kyiv. But Russia will run out of power long before then. In late 2024 and into 2025, Russia was taking some of the highest casualties per day of the war so far. At the moment, the fate of Ukraine rests on two factors: Western support for Ukraine and the Russian people's willingness to continue to tolerate truly apocalyptic levels of casualties. For the former, Ukraine got an unexpected shot in the arm when the current U.S. administration cut ties with Vladimir Putin in Moscow. The U.S. seems to have turned a corner, and the president recently announced a doubling down on support for Ukraine. New missile interceptors, even entire Patriot batteries, and more have been pledged, with the U.S. giving Putin 50 days to reassess the situation. This has galvanized much of Europe, where many expected the U.S. to walk away from the war. Now, with renewed American backing, hope is growing that Ukraine might actually defeat Russia. But that hope remains fragile, because even with fearing U.S. withdrawal, most European nations still refuse to make the hard sacrifices needed to ensure a Ukrainian victory. The entire continent rests on a knife's edge and could teeter either way. Long ago, Putin mobilized the Russian economy for war, putting it in a position to threaten well past Ukraine in the near future. However, Russia is not without its challenges, especially as the U.S. ramps up sanctions on anyone it sees as aiding the Russian war effort. India and China, both big-time consumers of Russian oil, recently curbed their imports out of fear of secondary sanctions from the U.S. Yet, vital technologies and materials for the war effort still make their way into Russia, mostly from Chinese and Indian sources. On the manpower front, Russia is reaching the end of any sort of easy recruitment to feed the voracious appetite for corpses that fuels the Russian war effort. For the first 3 years of the war, Russia relied heavily on shady recruitment tactics and a deep well of desperate volunteers, mostly drawn from the country's poorest, most disenfranchised communities. In effect, Russia has conducted a legal ethnic cleansing, offering big pay packages to the poorest of Russians, often ethnic minorities. Russian officials have been frequently accused of not delivering promised pay packages or of withholding them until the end of a successful enlistment, and then sending those fresh recruits straight to the deadliest parts of the front. When they die before completing their enlistment, their family is denied the enlistment bonus and pay package that had been promised upon enlistment. Just ask the family of American Derek Huffman, who recently moved to Russia hoping to gain citizenship. Huffman enlisted in the Russian military and quickly learned what that really means. A trained welder, he was promised that he would serve behind the front lines or work as a war correspondent. In just under 2 weeks, it was alleged that he had been sent to the front. Within the first month, it's been reported by some sources that Mr. Huffman was killed, something his family denies. Russia's enlistment woes may prove to be its undoing. As with the pool of poor Russians, ethnic minorities, and even prisoners running shallow, it now comes time to recruit from the big cities. This is something Putin has avoided for years, because he knows that families from metropolitan Russian cities will create far greater political troubles for him than poor families from the countryside. It violates the social contract that the corrupt Putin regime established with the Russians from the onset. Its government is free to be as corrupt as it wants, as long as it doesn't mess with the people. Continuing a disastrous war may cost Putin the political support he needs to win it, placing victory within reach of Ukraine. But what if it does win? All occupied regions liberated, Russian forces thrown back across the border in humiliated disgrace. What next? First and foremost, there is the political cost of a defeat, something Putin is unlikely to be able to bear. After years of propaganda and projecting a strong Russian state, the defeat in Ukraine would prove that its army is a paper tiger, one wholly unfit to face off against the threat it was designed to counter, NATO. From a military standpoint alone, this could prove lethal to Putin. Putin could find himself facing off against hordes of disenfranchised, angry soldiers, many of which are still waiting on promised benefits or pay packages, a repeat of the revolution that brought the communists to power in World War I. We got a preview of what this could look like in 2023, when Wagner PMC's chief Yevgeny Prigozhin marched on Moscow with a small army of mercenaries. Despite only being a few hundred strong at its peak, Prigozhin's army repelled aerial attacks from the military as it moved along the highway to Moscow from the Ukrainian border. They even seized a major Russian city and drove out local military leadership. Military personnel standing between Prigozhin and Moscow didn't just fail to stop his march, they actively allowed it, refusing to stand against Wagner. In the end, Prigozhin called the whole thing off, thanks to Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko brokering a deal. Prigozhin was assassinated months later with a bomb in his private plane. But such a march by veterans is something that Putin fears could still happen, with mounting discontent over not just the war, but failure to deliver promised benefits and pay. It could happen much sooner than Putin could predict. Russia's war chest, its sovereign wealth fund, is rapidly approaching the bottom of the barrel. Without access to its seized overseas assets, Russia has had to rely on its wealth fund to finance the war and offset political unrest. It's estimated that Russia only has around $50 billion left in liquid assets, down from well over $110 billion in 2022. Within one more year, this fund will almost certainly be completely exhausted, putting the cost of the war entirely on the regular state budget, which is already running steep deficits. Nations can and do run deficits during wartime. The French economy continued resistance during World War I, even well beyond what it could technically afford. But facing the most sanctions of any country ever, Russia is already having trouble sourcing materials for advanced weapons. And then there's the question of how much the Russian people will tolerate in the name of a failing war of aggression. A military defeat is sure to fire up the Russian population, backed up by millions of combat veterans, many of which have disabilities or unresolved psychological trauma caused by the fighting. The Russian state would soon find itself deploying its military against its own people. And there's questions about just how many modern Russian soldiers would follow orders to act against their own people. Most of them were civilians not too long ago and are still missing promised pay packages and other benefits. All it would take is one charismatic individual to exploit the situation, and Putin would find himself facing a homegrown army intent on his replacement. But others within Putin's circle might calculate that after losing in Ukraine, Putin is at last vulnerable. Like any dictator, Putin maintains control by carefully cultivating his inner circle and pitting them against each other. If they're too busy hating each other, they can't join forces in shared hatred of Putin himself. A defeat, though, could expose just how weak Putin has become and prompt those sitting on the sidelines to act. We know that Putin fears the power of the Russian oligarchs, given how he has taken extreme measures to keep them in check and intimidated. Numerous oligarchs and other prominent social figures have met their end via a fall from a high window, clear murders orchestrated by Putin himself. This intimidation tactic has so far worked. But with oligarchs watching more and more of their wealth disappear by the year, it's a question of how long before they throw their support behind a successor to Putin, and their money could buy a whole lot of loyalty from disenfranchised Russians. But Putin has another enemy to fear, one he cultivated himself. Vladimir Putin has always leaned heavily on his state security apparatus, Russian law enforcement and intelligence agencies. It was his use of Russian intelligence agents to launch several false flag bombings of Russian apartment blocks that led to his cementing his grip on power. The fake terror attacks blamed on Chechen terrorists catapulted at the time a relatively unknown prime minister to the national spotlight. The war that followed may have been disastrous for Russia, but it served Putin's purpose of rallying the Russian people behind him. From then on, he has used the state security apparatus to keep tabs on dissidents within Russia, and especially amongst the people who really matter in Russia, the elite. On his order, dozens of dissenting elites have found themselves thrown out of a window, courtesy of Russian secret agents, all reporting to Putin. The intelligence and law enforcement have been strengthened so much, it's likely a challenger to a weakened Putin would arise from within federal law enforcement, or more likely the FSB itself. Senior military leaders could also make a successful bid for power, backed up by an army of disenfranchised Russian conscripts bloodied on the front lines of the Ukraine war. Whatever the avenue of his demise, Putin faces many internal threats, which is why he rewards loyalty so richly despite obvious incompetence. Former Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu, through his incompetence and corruption, has done much more to help the Ukrainian cause than most Western aid. And yet, when he was eventually replaced, he was simply shuffled to another senior position within Putin's government, rather than ousted the way his incompetence demanded. This weakens the Russian government overall, but it keeps those loyal to Putin close, and thus potential threats at bay. And then there's the Nationalists, hardliners who even now grow increasingly bold in their protest of how the Kremlin is handling the war. These are the same people who have called for open use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and who have cheered on massacres of Ukrainian civilians and POWs alike. They have served as Putin's base of support for propagating the war. But as the incompetence of the Russian military is laid bare and casualties mount to astronomical levels, even their patience wears thin. An all-out defeat would enrage the hardline nationalists who could quickly turn on Putin and his regime, once more backed up by hordes of angry former and even active duty soldiers. These hardliners could pose a threat outside of Russia as well. Seizing local nuclear weapon stockpiles, hardliners might seek a form of revenge against Ukraine, maybe even the West. Leaders within the nationalist movement could gamble that a nuclear attack on Ukraine's eastern cities, ones currently held or claimed by Russia, may not be enough to provoke a serious Western reaction. Or perhaps they would gamble that, much like conventional conflict, the West would blanch at the thought of punishing Russia for the use of nuclear weapons. Within this line of reasoning, punitive attacks against non-nuclear Eastern NATO members like Poland or one of the Baltic states could take place. NATO would face an impossible decision: retaliate with nuclear weapons against an attack not officially ordered by the Russian government, or risk appearing weak. Either choice could spiral the conflict completely out of control. Many nationalists today know just how reluctant the West would be to face this scenario, and they are in fact counting on it as a justification to use nuclear weapons. The world may cheer the collapse of the Putin regime, only to be horrified by what elements within Russia use that chaos to perpetuate against the countries that they would blame for Russia's defeat. Russia is a nation that's held together by strong centralized control, with many regions, especially in the South and Far East, having some level of independence movements. Muslim-majority regions have traditionally caused Moscow the most problems, but in the Far East, Russia is quietly losing a demographic war to its so-called ally, China. Chinese investment vastly outpaces Russian spending in the region, and rising immigration threatens to make ethnic Russians a minority on their own soil. With a weakened central government due to a loss in Ukraine, regions could see various independence movements spring up simultaneously. Terrorism would increase dramatically almost overnight, especially against cosmopolitan and ethnic majority Russian cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. But in the Far East, an even greater threat looms: the potential loss of vast territory to China. China has made it clear for years now that it wants back territory ceded by its old imperial government to the Russian czars. Today, the territories are rich in natural resources such as oil and gas, prizes that Beijing has its eyes on. With most of its oil imports coming from the Middle East across oceans it can't defend, China is eager to shore up this strategic vulnerability. Already, official Chinese map makers have begun printing maps with the old Chinese names for these Russian territories. And the wave of immigration and investment into the Russian Far East hints strongly at an orchestrated plot rather than happenstance. In the wake of a collapsed or weakened central government, China could pull a page out of Russia's playbook and claim that it needs to protect ethnic Chinese on Russian territory. Russian troops, already weakened from years of fighting in Ukraine and likely lacking much conviction in a Moscow government, would face off against modern, fully staffed mechanized Chinese forces. It's a proposition already so dire for Russia that as recently as the mid-2010s, it is trained to use nuclear weapons in the opening stages of a Chinese invasion. The conflict could become nuclear, or it could be relatively bloodless with demoralized and outgunned Russian troops simply allowing the Chinese entry. That doesn't prevent a rogue Russian general from ordering the use of nuclear weapons anyway. With a weak central government, or perhaps none at all, there would be no real checks to his power to do so. Whatever the fate of the Russian government, its economy is certain to be destroyed in the wake of a loss to Ukraine. Putin himself has admitted that the economy is overheated and has called for less defense spending in 2026. The Russian central bank recently announced that it has run out of almost all reserve resources. Currently, the economy is being kept from crashing due to wartime mobilization and the use of the National Wealth Fund, a wealth fund predicted to last no more than another year. With the end of the National Wealth Fund, Vladimir Putin would have overseen one of the fastest losses of national wealth in modern history. But even more importantly, he could no longer cushion both the military and the economy from the effects of sanctions and wartime mobilization. Pensions for retirees would disappear overnight, as would all matters of social services across the board. The large pay packages that the militaries relied on for recruitment and to keep civil unrest low would also disappear. This is actually a bigger problem than most people know. In a convenient bit of mental gymnastics, Russian society has found a way to do that which it has historically always done: avoid blaming the government for the rampant death of the population and pin it on the dead instead. But if that money runs out, there's no excuses to hide behind anymore. People are dying because the government is corrupt and incompetent. Even the incredibly casualty-tolerant Russian people, for whom life is historically cheap, would find that a hard pill to swallow. Mobilizing the Russian economy for wartime production has done much to stave off inevitable collapse. However, what Putin is actually doing is burning the candle at both ends. Wartime production can fuel an economy for years, but it's in effect cannibalizing itself to do so. Unlike consumer goods and services, wartime goods produce zero economic value unless they're used for conquest. A tank once built will not earn a return on investment, only trigger even more spending on fuel, maintenance, and ammunition. The Russian economy may seem to be weathering international sanctions and the cost of the war in Ukraine, but it's an economy headed for disaster the moment the war stops. Without foreign investments and the lifting of sanctions, the Russian economy cannot bear the cost of defeat or victory. Paradoxically, it must keep fighting in order to stave off total collapse. This is why, even during periods of more cordial relations, the US offered Putin talks on lifting sanctions and negotiating new energy deals. The goal was to create a soft economic landing, Russia's only real hope of transitioning from war to peace without disaster. And yet, not only has the US seemingly done a 180 on Russia, but the rest of the world is extremely unlikely to simply forgive Russia for its many war crimes and wanton aggression. Europe, in particular, most threatened by Russia and even the victim of kinetic sabotage and murder by Russian intelligence, is unlikely to simply lift sanctions the moment the war ends. This means that the Russian economy is speeding straight at a looming brick wall, a disaster made worse if Russia loses and is forced by the international community to pay reparations to Ukraine. In fact, the prospect of a nuclear-armed Russia collapsing might be what forces the world to lift their sanctions anyway. It's neither fair nor just, but if the choice is between keeping Russia intact and its nuclear arsenal under control, or risking civil war and atomic weapons falling into unknown hands, the world will likely do everything it can to prevent Moscow from falling. Alternatively, the end of the Ukraine war could trigger a new one if Moscow does in fact fall. With a catastrophic collapse of the Kremlin regime, NATO and even China may not have any other option but to invade Russian territory and carry out aggressive airstrikes, all targeting Russia's nuclear capabilities. Western special forces backed up by paratroopers and eventually even mechanized ground forces could launch incursions into Russia in order to seize nuclear facilities and stockpiles against both the Russian military and Russian separatists. If seizing them is not possible, they may opt instead to carry out large-scale airstrikes and destroy these facilities and stockpiles in place. The truth is, there are a myriad of possible futures for a Russia that's defeated in Ukraine, and most of them are a nightmare for the rest of the civilized world. History has never seen a nuclear power collapse, but Russia is well on its way to being the first, and the consequences could be disastrous for everyone, no matter where on Earth you live. The real winner of Russia's collapse might surprise you. Watch why China wants Russia to lose Ukraine war, or click on this video instead.